This is Everything Financial Radio, and we are continuing our conversation with Mr. Ian Gordon of the Longwave Group. And, Ian, I want to go back, in the last segment, we talked about the fact that it appears that the housing market, at least in the U.S., might be recovering. But if you were to take the Federal Reserve factor out, that the Fed's buying so much every month in mortgage-backed securities, and the U.S. government either directly or indirectly backs 9 out of 10 new mortgages, without this government subsidization, what's the housing market look like?
Well, it would continue to fester, on the downside. But the point is, Dennis, as I see it, that all what appears to be a sort of a turnaround to the good is in fact really a kind of a make-believe scenario, and that eventually, the whole thing is going to roll over, and when it rolls over to the downside again, there'll be no stopping it, because the Fed can't can't basically buy everybody's mortgage, and they certainly, can't continue to buy up all the U.S. government debt. I think they're taking on something like 70% of all the new debt issue that the U.S. government is producing right now, so that it just would be an impossible number for the Fed to continue to do this. So when we do roll over, and we will roll over, I'm absolutely certain of this, because the issue, as I keep going to, is the debt issue, and that has not been addressed in any way. In fact, it's been compounded. So when we do roll over to the downside, I think we're going to face something far worse than we faced in the early 1930s, a depression of far greater magnitude this time than we experienced in the early 1930s.
Ian, what type of contraction from an economic perspective are we going to see, and how will investors be affected?
Well, I mean, the contraction between 1929 and 33 in the U.S. economy, GDP dropped by 45%. So that's a massive drop in the economy. And world trade, for instance, between those same years, effectively dropped by 80%. So this time around, I think the kind of contraction that we're going to see is going to be substantially greater than the 45% that was experienced in between 1929 and 33, simply because the debt is far greater this time around. And that really has to be purged from the system. And governments are trying to do everything they can to not let that happen, because they know that is going to be very, very bad for the economies.
So, Ian, this may be a question that's not fair to ask, but you're always such a good sport in answering any question I throw out at you. What is your estimation as to how long it will take for this debt to be purged from the system?
Well, I think once the thing sort of rolls over, it happens very quickly. You'll have massive bankruptcies. You'll have consumer bankruptcies, corporate bankruptcies. You're going to have tremendous problems in the financial system. We're going to go back to something even worse than 2008. The whole system is going to collapse, and the world economies will collapse. World trade will collapse. You'll have protectionism developing worldwide, and danger, because in that kind of environment, people kind of get bellicose and trying to sort of sort out their problems by taking it out on other countries. So, we're going to go through a very, very dire and desperate period in the world economies, and I think that is facing us much sooner rather than later. So I suspect that within a year, maybe 2 at the most, things are going to appear far, far worse than they currently appear to be.
Ian, I want to go back and just talk a little bit about paper money, because certainly when one studies history, gold and silver have always historically been money, and then there has been paper money with a link to gold or silver, maybe with some predetermined exchange rate. And I may be mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the only time in recorded monetary history that we don't have any link between paper money and gold or silver or something tangible. So every single country is operating with a fiat currency, and we know also, studying history, that fiat currencies have always failed. So I'm assuming you're probably predicting that there will be some currency failures. I'd like your take on maybe which currencies and how U.S. investors might be affected.
Well, I think in essence, all currencies, all fiat currencies are going to fail. I mean, we've always sort of predicted that the world monetary system collapsed in the last economic winter, the last Longwave winter between 1931 and 33. And we've always envisioned that the same sort of collapse would develop during this economic winter. My feeling is that a country like China, which is accumulating gold on a massive scale, will eventually tie their currency to gold. And when they do that, that will force every other country to do the same, because no one will trust the currencies of those countries that don't tie their money to gold. So, and everyone will be forced to return to something like a gold standard, which forces discipline on the governments and that kind of thing. So, but I think China will be the country that will basically assume the role as the world reserve currency by tying the renminbi to gold.
And Ian, when you talk about China, I was reading an article this past week in Business Times, and a number of Chinese graduates college graduates are having difficulty finding jobs. The Chinese economy, the rate of growth is slowing. It's not contracting by a long shot from what I've seen. However, when you look at debt levels in China, they have their own issues at the municipal level. So will China be participating in this deflationary environment as well? And is the idea that possibly the renminbi gets tied to gold going to be after China endures some of this economic pain as well?
Well, the thing is that she may do that in advance of experiencing the pain. I mean, imagine the world trade seizing as it did between 1929 and 33 by 70-80%. Imagine that happening, and how crippling that will be to the Chinese economy. But China is the world's greatest creditor nation, and traditionally the world's greatest creditor nation has basically been the reserve currency nation as well. And I think to be the reserve currency nation, China's going to have to tie the renminbi to gold. And she's obviously working fast to accumulate gold so that she can do that. And once she does that, even though everybody, and Nikolai Kondratiev said that the cycle, every capitalist country was basically going to go through the Longwave and endure the Longwave cycle. So, and we can say, well, China isn't really a capitalist country, but effectively it is. So every country is going to go. We're going to return to something akin to the Depression of the 30s, where every country has to go through that process because of the debt. It's the washing out of the debt that has to take place during the economic winter and during that depression, and that's what brings on the depression, is the debt.
Ian, when you look back at the last economic winter of the 30s, this deflationary period obviously led to a decline in trade. You mentioned that countries start to blame other countries for their economic woes, and that led to certainly geopolitical tensions and war. And, I hate to even talk about it. When you look at some of the tensions taking place around the world today, Syria, for instance, and some of the sides that are being taken and some of the lines being drawn in the sand. Are we going to see, in your opinion, something similar in the current economic winter?
Well, I'm pretty sure that we will do. The United States cut Japan off from oil and this kind of thing, and Japan became very belligerent in the 30s and invaded Manchuria and so on, and eventually basically all down into Burma and Myanmar right now. But I can see issues with China, the aggression that China is showing in the South China Sea and so on. And certainly I can see issues in China where China is going to sort of seek water. She has huge water problems, fresh water problems, and I could see China invading Burma, for instance, to get the great water supplies from the Irrawaddy River and so on. So we will have a massive increase in international tension as the depression takes hold and as world trade ceases.
Ian, we have about a minute and a half left in this segment. What is your take for just major stock market indices around the world as these events unfold?
Well, again, I think there will be a major crash. Eventually, stock markets have to reflect the reality of the economy. I mean, the stock market in the United States is being propped up by things such as quantitative easing, where the banks are being effectively given $1 trillion a year in free money, and they're not really putting it to use in terms of putting that money back into the economy. They're using it to speculate. So once things become dire in the economy, the stock markets will start to reflect that. And when that happens, we could see something quite horrendous. I mean, if I can just quote to you a person who I have a great deal of faith in, he's talking about the stock market going into a centuries kind of a bear market for the centuries, and the economy is going to be as bad as we've ever sort of experienced since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the world economy. So things are going to get much, much worse, and I think that people who sort of feel that somehow the governments and people in power can sort out these problems are very much mistaken. I'm really kind of fearful about how things are going to sort of unfold here on in.
Well, we have been chatting today with Mr. Ian Gordon of the Longwave Group. And, Ian, always a pleasure to have you on the program and get your perspective. We appreciate you joining us today and hope you'll come back.
I will. Thank you very much for having me.
Everything Financial Radio will return after these words. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Everything Financial Radio program, and thanks again to Mr. Ian Gordon for his time this past week. I was talking to Mr. Gordon after the interview about debt levels worldwide. And when we started talking about the ultimate consequences of this debt, like we did in the interview you just heard, we began to discuss the derivatives market. Now, Mr. Gordon stated something that I found quite shocking. I had seen estimates of the derivative market being somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 trillion worldwide, which is in and of itself alarming. But Mr. Gordon told me that the number is in excess of $1 quadrillion. Now, a quadrillion dollars is 1,000 $1 trillion. So it's 1,000 times 1 trillion. It's a staggering, almost unreal number. So I started to do some research, and I found an article published on Daily Finance back in 2010 that explains the magnitude of this largely unregulated market. Now, I'm going to give you just a bit from the article, so if you don't understand what a derivative is and how this might affect you and your money, you'll get a better understanding of it. This from the article: One of the biggest risks to the world's financial health is the $1.2 quadrillion derivatives market. $1.2 quadrillion derivatives market. It's complex, it's unregulated, and it ought to be of concern to world leaders that its notional value is 20 times the size of the world's economy. One of the world's leading derivatives experts, a gentleman by the name of Paul Wilmot, who has a doctorate in applied mathematics from Oxford University, is quoted in the article, and he confirms that $1.2 quadrillion is the so-called notional value of the worldwide derivatives market. Now, to put that in perspective, the world's annual gross domestic product is between $50 and $60 trillion. So the entire planet produces about $60 trillion a year. And $1.2 quadrillion is the notional value of the worldwide derivatives market. Now, if you don't understand what notional value is, let me give you just an example. Let's say you decide to go buy an apartment complex, and it's going to cost $1 million. And you go borrow the money to do that, and the interest rate that you're paying on your loan that you use to buy the apartment building resets every 6 months. Now, you go out and rent all the apartments, and you rent them out at a monthly fixed rate. And at the end of the month, if you add up all your income and subtract from it all your expenses, including interest, if the income is greater than the expenses, you make money. However, if interest rates were to suddenly spike, depending on how close your income and expenses ran, you might find that if interest rates went up, you could find yourself losing money. So what you might do is hedge this risk, and that's really what a derivative is. It's a hedge, and most of the derivatives market is to hedge interest rates. Now, in order to hedge your interest rate on the apartment building, you would have to actually go take out a loan with a fixed rate of interest. And to do that, you'd have to find a counterparty who has an asset with a fixed rate of return who believed that interest rates were going to fall. And this person would be willing to swap his fixed rate for your variable one. So if interest rates fall, you lose and your counterparty wins. But if interest rates rise, you win and your counterparty loses. That's the nature of derivatives. It's a zero-sum game, and it's a very important point to understand. Now, in this example, the $1 million apartment building is the notional value. So Mr. Wilmot concludes, I believe correctly, that derivatives represent a risk of unknown proportions. Unfortunately, Mr. Wilmot believes that regulators are not in a good position to assess the risks of derivatives because, according to Mr. Wilmot, it's his view that regulators simply don't understand them. And if regulators don't understand the risks in derivatives, Wilmot says, chances are great that Congress doesn't understand them either. So derivatives are essentially liabilities on top of liabilities. Now, a recent article published in Forbes just last month, in fact, talks about the fact that derivatives are a zero-sum game. For every winner, there is a loser. The size of the win typically equals the size of the loss. Now, I'll give you just a bit from the article because it goes back and references the financial meltdown that occurred in 2008. In 2008, the article explains derivatives exposure bankrupted Lehman. It was a $600 billion bankruptcy case that clocked in as the largest bankruptcy filing since the beginning of time. The worldwide market tremors we witnessed after Lehman's failure caused many other highly leveraged institutions to fail. However, the ones that failed in the most spectacular way were those with the most derivatives exposure. Think about AIG here, Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Washington Mutual, Ambec, to name a few. Perhaps, unfortunately, many of the biggest weren't allowed to fail. Rather, taxpayers like us helped to bail them out due to the fear that rippling systemic risk would drive our country into a deep and long-lasting depression if we didn't. So because of this, the biggest institutions with the most derivatives exposures continued to stay in business. So now here we are a few years later, the dust has settled. And where do we stand now? Well, the Forbes article points out that the largest banks in the country hold a lot more derivatives than they did. In fact, in the country right now, there's $223 trillion worth of derivatives. J.P. Morgan holds $69 trillion, Citibank $55.5 trillion, Bank of America $42.4 trillion, and Goldman Sachs $41.2. Now, Goldman addresses this in their 10K, their filing, and it says, gross fair values, excluding netting and receivable balances, are therefore not representative of the firm's exposure. Notional amounts provide an indication of the volume of the firm's derivative activity. However, they do not represent anticipated losses. Now, that's great for Goldman, unless the counterparty can't pay because of unforeseen circumstances. See, AIG was a huge Goldman counterparty before the taxpayers bailed it out back in 2007, 2008. Well, these notional values now are really big. They're bigger than they were in 2007 and 2008. So in spite of all this financial reform, none of it has effectively addressed the risk that lies in the derivatives market. Now, because derivatives are in fact a zero-sum game, there are some facts that you need to be aware of. For each party that makes money on a transaction, another party loses money. That's just the way derivatives work. When the taxpayers bailed out AIG had lost so much money it couldn't pay, so the taxpayers had to cover the losses. When interest rates move, derivatives that hedge interest rate risk will create winners and losers. Will interest rates move? Yes. When? Some future date. The what is a lot easier to predict than the when, but we know interest rates will move. The derivative market, according to the Forbes article, is $223 trillion in the U.S., and according to the Daily Finance article, $1.2 quadrillion worldwide. The fact is there's not enough money on the planet to cover the losers the next time around. This is not a political statement. It's simply a math statement. The math dictates there will be more bank failures in the future when interest rates move. My question is, are you prepared? What have you done? And have you gathered the facts and educated yourself? We are all about education. That's what our new retirement rules class is all about. You can learn more by going to the website, newretirementrules.com. If there is capacity for the July class, you'll be able to register there online as well as get some more information. Glad you joined me this week. Tune in again next week, same time. Bye.